Jack the Ripper terrorized London in the autumn of 1888. But to understand why, you have to understand the ground he walked into. Because London's East End wasn't just poor. It was a place built, brick by brick, out of desperation, neglect, and fear that had been accumulating for decades before anyone ever spoke the words Leather Apron or Jack the Ripper, the name that would later appear in the notorious Dear Boss letter, the correspondence that made that nickname permanent and sent the city into full panic. At the start of the 19th century, London was already the largest city on earth. By 1851, it held 2.7 million people. By the turn of the century, 6.6 million. That growth didn't happen evenly. Waves of rural poor arrived looking for work in the new factories, and they landed hardest in the East End, in districts like Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green. There was no planning for it, and no infrastructure built to absorb it. Just more and more people packed into less and less space, year after year, decade after decade. So what was it about Whitechapel specifically that made it the perfect ground for the kind of panic that would grip London that autumn? By the 1880s, Whitechapel had a reputation respectable Londoners simply didn't go near. One writer of the era called it terra incognita, unknown territory, as if it were some unmapped corner of the world rather than a district, a few minutes' walk from the wealth of the City of London. That distance, physical and social, mattered enormously. It meant the people who had the power to fix these conditions mostly chose not to look at them, and the people forced to live inside those conditions understood exactly how little the rest of the city cared. The man who forced London to look was a shipowner named Charles Booth. Booth didn't believe the socialist claim that a quarter of Londoners lived in poverty. He thought it was exaggerated, so he set out to prove it with data, employing school board visitors and his own researchers to survey poverty street by street, household by household, across the entire city. What he found was worse than the claim he'd set out to debunk. Roughly 1 in 3 Londoners were living in poverty, not 1 in 4. He color-coded his findings on a map, block by block, a level of documentation nobody had ever attempted before. Light blue for poor, dark blue for very poor, chronic want, and black for what he labeled the lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal. Whole stretches of Whitechapel were colored black on that map, and the map itself became one of the most influential pieces of social research of the entire Victorian era, forcing a reckoning that mere argument never could have. What did that poverty actually look like day to day? Overcrowding on a scale that's hard to picture now. Multiple families, sometimes crammed 9 people deep, sharing a single room. In Whitechapel alone, more than 200 common lodging houses sprang up to house over 8,000 homeless and destitute people every single night. These weren't shelters in any comfortable sense. Ventilation was minimal, and sanitation was worse. Often nothing more than a shared privy in a back courtyard, if that. Privacy didn't exist. A bed for the night cost a few pence, and if you didn't have the pence, you walked the streets until morning. Instead, streets like Bucks Row, where by the following year those pre-dawn hours would mean something far darker. Reformers did try to answer this crisis, at least partially. Starting in 1862, the American philanthropist George Peabody endowed a trust to build what were called model dwellings, blocks of clean, self-contained flats meant to replace the worst slum housing with something livable. A Whitechapel estate went up in 1880 and 1881. Hundreds of flats built specifically for the East End's working poor, but the reform had a blind spot baked into it from the start. Tenants were carefully screened and generally had to be in steady work to qualify, which meant the truly destitute, the casual laborers, and the chronically unemployed were shut out entirely. The East End's own coroner at the time, Wynne Baxter, who would later preside over the inquests into the Ripper murders themselves, methodically documenting each victim's wounds and circumstances, put it bluntly, the very poorest hated the restraint of a model dwelling almost as much as they hated the workhouse, and would rather stay in a wretched hovel than submit to either. The reform helped some people. It left the most vulnerable exactly where they'd always been. A few miles from those new Peabody blocks in Bethnal Green sat a slum known simply as the Nichol. One survey from the era described 2 adjoining houses, 6 rooms each, holding 48 people between them. Water ran from a single tap at the back for 10 or 12 minutes a day, and not at all on Sundays. Rooms below ground level, damp and permanently dark, still rented for 2 shillings a week. The Nichols' reputation was so bad that working-class families in the rest of Bethnal Green avoided the area entirely. Some people, according to one account from a resident, wished a wall could be built around it, so the rest of the world wouldn't have to see inside. This is the setting that later inspired Arthur Morrison's fiction, the phrase, the Jago, drawn almost directly from the real geography of the Nichol. But fiction didn't need to exaggerate much. The reality was already extreme enough on its own. Poverty in the East End wasn't just about squalor. It was also about who was arriving and why. Waves of Irish migrants had settled in the district following the Great Famine of the 1840s, drawn by cheap rents and dock work, however unstable that work actually was. From the 1880s onward, large numbers of Jewish immigrants arrived too, fleeing pogroms and persecution across Russia and Eastern Europe. So many that by 1888 some pockets of Whitechapel were estimated to be as much as 95% Jewish. Many found work in tailoring, cobbling, and small-scale manufacturing, the so-called sweated trades, low-paid piecework done in cramped, airless workshops for punishing hours, often for a wage that barely covered the rent on a single room. This immigration reshaped Whitechapel into one of the most culturally mixed districts in the British Empire, resilient and entrepreneurial by necessity, but it also created friction. Economic competition for the scarce, low-paying work bred resentment among longer-established residents, and that resentment curdled easily into open prejudice against the newest arrivals. That same distrust extended directly to the police. Whitechapel was policed by H Division of the Metropolitan Police, a force that had existed since 1830 but had never remotely kept pace with the district's explosive growth. By 1888, H Division numbered somewhere around 500 to 575 officers for a population of roughly 37,000 packed into less than a square mile. Only a fraction of those officers were ever walking a beat at any given moment. Overseeing the entire metropolitan force at the time was Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, a former Army officer and archaeologist who ran the department on strict military lines. Warren would spend the autumn of 1888 under withering press criticism over the failure to catch the killer terrorizing his city, and by November, he'd resigned the post entirely, worn down by scrutiny. He never fully recovered from including the controversy over his order to erase a chalk message found near Catherine Eddowes' body in Mitre Square, a decision that destroyed what might have been vital evidence and fueled accusations that the investigation was being mishandled from the top. Leading the actual detective work on the ground was Chief Inspector Frederick Abberline, brought back to Whitechapel specifically because of his years of experience on that beat. Abberline's investigation and Warren's public unraveling under pressure became as much a part of the East End story that autumn as the murders themselves. Working alongside the police was Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon whose post-mortem analysis of the victims, particularly Mary Jane Kelly, led him to produce one of the earliest examples of criminal profiling in British legal history, attempting to construct a picture of the killer's likely background, occupation, and habits from the nature of the wounds alone. Poverty, overcrowding, prejudice, and that gap in trust between residents and law enforcement produced crime as a matter of simple survival math. East End crime in this period took a specific organized shape: street gangs, operating in the vacuum the police left behind. The Blind Beggar Mob, named for the pub in Mile End Road where they met, ran protection rackets and robberies. The Hoxton High Rips were violent enough that police genuinely considered them as suspects in the Whitechapel murders themselves. The Bessarabians and the Odessans, feuding gangs drawn out of the Jewish immigrant community, ran their own intimidation rackets against local shopkeepers. When a woman named Emma Elizabeth Smith was fatally assaulted in April of 1888, months before Marianne Nichols was killed on Bucks Row, and became the first of the 5 murders. Now permanently linked to Jack the Ripper's name, Smith told police before she died that she'd been attacked by 3 men, one barely more than a boy. Police suspected a local gang, precisely because that kind of group violence was such a routine feature of life in the district, even though Smith herself is not counted among the canonical Ripper victims. The 5, who are Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all women living in exactly the conditions this script has been describing. Occasional lodging house residents, working casual labor, navigating survival on the margins of a city that had provided no safety net and no protection. Stride and Eddowes were killed on the same night, the 30th of September, in what newspapers called the double event, a night that confirmed the murders were escalating rather than stopping. Kelly, the last and youngest of the five, was killed indoors on Miller's Court in November, the only murder that took place behind a closed door, which, investigators including Dr. Thomas Bond concluded, gave the killer time and privacy to carry out the most extreme injuries of the entire series. By the time Annie Chapman was killed, that September, in what newspapers would soon be calling London's Autumn of Terror, the East End's underlying conditions had already been building towards some kind of breaking point for years. What all of this created, by 1888, was a district under enormous, compounding pressure from every direction at once, overcrowded beyond any modern standard, economically squeezed by exploitative piecework, imperfectly served even by the housing reforms meant to help, and yet policed by a force stretched too thin and trusted too little. It took the murders themselves to make the rest of London actually pay attention. In September of that year, the playwright George Bernard Shaw wrote a letter to the Star newspaper, sharp with irony, pointing out that a serial killer had done in a matter of weeks what decades of socialist agitation and reform lecturing had failed to do, force the comfortable classes to finally look at how the poor of Whitechapel were living. Shaw wasn't excusing the murders. He was making a darker point, that it had taken this much horror for anyone with power to notice conditions that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. None of this excuses what came next. The false accusations, the mob hunting a nickname instead of a person, the very real danger that put innocent men like a Mulberry Street bootmaker in fear for his life. But it does explain it. Panic doesn't erupt out of nothing. It erupts out of conditions like these: overcrowding, poverty, prejudice, an under-policed vacuum filled by organized street violence, and a total absence of trust between a community and the institutions meant to protect it. Whitechapel in 1888 wasn't a Gothic stage set invented later by storytellers looking for atmosphere. It was a real, working, suffering neighborhood, home to families doing everything they could to survive inside a system that had almost entirely given up on them. Understanding that reality doesn't just add color to the story of that autumn's panics and murders, it's the only way to actually understand them at all.